panic. They downplayed the severity of the disease. After the death of several sailors and civilians, the health board confidently declared the disease had reached its zenith and already begun to decline. It hadn't even gotten started. At the same time, the federal government was desperate for money from war bonds to fund the war. People would buy bonds, essentially loaning the government money for a promise of being paid back later with interest. Every city had a quota of bonds they had to sell, and Philadelphia was ready to hold the Liberty Loan Parade to sell war bonds. Public health doctors begged the city to cancel the parade, terrified that it would cause the outbreak to become an epidemic. The city government ignored them. On September 28th, hundreds of thousands of people jammed into the downtown streets to watch the parade. In that huddled crowd, all crushed together, it only took a few coughing, sneezing people to launch the epidemic. Within 76 hours, just 3 days later, the city's 31 hospitals had run out of bed space. They were completely full. Some hospitals tried to cram in more by laying patients on cots in the hallways, in offices, and on balconies. In some cases, the sick were laid on the floor next to a dying patient. Once the patient died, the body was taken away, and the new patient would be lifted into the same bed, still warm from the previous occupant. The city opened several temporary emergency hospitals, but it wasn't enough. Hospitals started refusing to accept any more patients. People lined up outside begging to be let in. Some died standing in line. Even for those who got in, care was non-existent for most people. The hospitals ran out of medicine. The doctors and nurses were overtaxed, and they were dropping from the flu. They were desperate for help. People with no medical training volunteered. Physicians and nurses came out of retirement. Medical schools closed, and first-year medical students were put in charge of an entire floor of a hospital. One medical student reported that during the height of the outbreak, 1/4 of all the patients in the hospital died every day. Nurses were so overtaxed, they began adding toe tags to the living so they could tag several at once. Once a patient turned blue, it was only a matter of hours to death, so they felt confident in tagging them. Sometimes there wasn't any time for any intervention. Some people died within 24 hours of contracting the flu. A nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital started her shift in the morning and suddenly fell ill. She died 12 hours after first feeling sick. The number of dead kept growing. 5 days after the city held the Liberty Loan Parade, city leaders finally acted. The health department banned all public meetings. Churches, schools, and theaters were closed. They left the bars open, but those too were closed the next day. The courts closed and city services shut down. It took only a few days for the city's operations to completely grind to a halt. Within just 10 days, Philadelphia went from a few hundred cases of flu and a couple deaths per day to hundreds of thousands of people sick and hundreds dying every day, all because they ignored public health guidelines. By 3 weeks after the parade, the death toll stood at 4,500. So many died that they couldn't be buried fast enough. Gravediggers were sick or refused to bury flu victims. The bodies started piling up inside morgues and funeral homes. Some undertakers raised their prices 500% to try and cash in. Most ran out of coffins. One funeral home that hadn't run out hired guards because people were trying to steal the coffins. People began wrapping their dead in blankets or sewing together flour sacks to use as shrouds. No one came to take the bodies, and there was nowhere to bring them, so the dead stayed in the homes. People wrapped them in blankets and set them in closed-off rooms. The bodies were laid on porches or stacked in back alleys. In the poor, overcrowded tenement houses where multiple families lived in one apartment, there were no porches or spare rooms to put the bodies. They set them in the corners or stacked them in the alleyways next to the shared outhouses and drinking water pumps. Sometimes people were so sick that the person in bed next to them would die, and they couldn't gather the strength to take the body away. The city began to smell, the stench of death hanging heavily in the air. Finally, families began digging their own graves to bury their dead. Everyone was terrified. People avoided each other. There were cases of children whose parents got sick, and the children starved because no one would go near them in case the child was sick. This was particularly a problem since those who were most likely to die were people aged between 20 to 40, many of them parents. People couldn't get food because no trucks were delivering goods in the city. The streets fell silent. Every business was closed. People hid inside their homes. The streetcars stopped. The police cars stopped. the entire city ceased to function. You were constantly afraid. You were afraid because you saw so much death around you. You were surrounded by death. When each day dawned, you didn't know whether you would be there when the sun set that day. It wiped out entire families from the time that the day began in the morning to bedtime at night. There wasn't any single soul left. William Sardo, Washington, D.C. The Philadelphia city government was by now non-functional. Wealthy Philadelphia families appealed to the federal government for help, but there was no help to send. Cities all across America were buckling beneath the weight of the epidemic, and the federal government was busy managing the outbreak on military bases and among troops in Europe. With the city government failing to act, the women of elite Philadelphia families, many of the same who had organized the Liberty Loan Parade, banded together to start outreach efforts. They gathered together civic leaders from across the city to start planning. They set up a special hotline to answer questions about the flu, but had a hard time keeping it staffed because so many employees were sick. They set up local neighborhood leaders who would organize distribution of food and medical care. They set up soup kitchens in the schools and food delivery to sick people when possible. 500 people volunteered their cars to be used as ambulances and to deliver food and drive doctors around to treat the sick. However, there was a desperate need for more volunteers, and most people were too afraid to get involved. Leaders begged for more help, but people turned away. The fabric of society began to break down. City leaders who hadn't bothered to attend meetings of the outreach effort finally got involved. They seized the city's emergency fund to pay for supplies and pay health workers. They opened additional morgues and sent out policemen to try and clear the piled-up bodies. Like the ancient plagues, people carried their dead out to the streets. There the bodies were loaded onto open trucks or horse-drawn wagons. There were no coffins, so they stacked them one on top of the other. Also, like in the days of the plague, they stopped trying to bury people individually and began digging mass graves, where hundreds of bodies were dumped in. The city used construction equipment to dig long trenches and push the bodies in. Someone would stand by the trench, say a prayer, and then the steam shovels would push dirt over the piles of bodies. By late October, the epidemic was finally beginning to loosen its death grip on the city. In its aftermath, it left a death toll of 13,000. It also left thousands of orphaned children, a shortage of food and goods, and a stalled city that had to slowly grind its most basic services back into motion. Finally, it left a changed people, filled with fear, wearied by war and disease, and crushed by grief. The people of Phoenix are facing a crisis. Almost every home in the city has been stricken with the plague. Arizona Republican, November 8, 1918. In other cities and towns across America, the news was the same. In New York City, 33,000 people died before the statisticians stopped counting. Some small towns tried to keep the virus out by quarantining themselves. They shut down all businesses and canceled public gatherings. People were ordered to stay in their homes and not touch or visit others. Some towns made it illegal to shake hands. In other towns, police were dispatched to nail signs on the doors of homes where people were sick. The signs said, "Influenza," in red letters. Rumors spread in Phoenix, Arizona, that dogs spread the disease. Policemen killed dogs in the streets, and people killed their own pets. Towns in Colorado set up barricades on the roads, and men guarded them with shotguns, preventing anyone from coming in. Other towns couldn't stop the trains from rolling through on their local platforms, but they refused to let anyone step off the trains. Anyone who did was thrown in prison and quarantined. It didn't work. The virus still slipped in. The only place that escaped the worst of the wrath was San Francisco, and historians credit that to aggressive response by the local government, who listened to their public health officials. Public Health Director William Hassler quarantined all naval stations before they had any reported cases. He knew it was only a matter of time. He ordered all public schools and gathering places closed. He divided the cities into separate districts with distinct support staff so as to segregate outbreaks. He laid out plans and organized the flu response before the flu ever hit the city so they would be ready when it did. The city's government, medical, and civic organizations banded together to educate citizens on prevention such as hand washing, avoiding public places, and wearing a face mask. While Philadelphia's government was still denying there was a problem, San Francisco authorities were distributing 100,000 face masks. Police enforced the face mask rule at gunpoint and actually shot people who refused to wear masks in the streets. As the second wave diminished throughout the country, San Francisco rejoiced for having missed the flu. The flu would mutate once more and rage through the world for a third time, but infecting and killing fewer people. This time it would be less severe. This time it did hit San Francisco because they thought the flu was already over. The third wave hit the Southwest and Midwest hard, but for the rest of America, the worst of the flu had passed. Even as America woke from the nightmare, the epidemic had left its imprint. Right at the height of harvest time, farmers had been too sick to farm, and workers didn't show up to gather the food in. Food that was harvested rotted in warehouses because there was no one to transport it. There was a lag while the country tried to catch up on shipping food and goods, and store shelves and markets stayed empty for some time because goods hadn't been delivered. As winter rolled in, there was a shortage of coal and other goods. However, the weary country still rejoiced, for an armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. The war was finally over, even as the plague and its effects lingered on. In the U.S., it killed about 675,000. The flu killed an estimated 3% of the entire world population. In Latin America, the flu killed 10 out of every 1,000 people. In Africa, about 15 out of every 1,000 died, and in parts of Asia, the death rate was as high as 35 per thousand. In Tahiti, it killed 10% of the population, and in Western Samoa, 20% of the population died. In India alone, it killed about 20 million people. You may be asking yourself, could a deadly flu like that happen again? It's important to understand that the Spanish flu was devastating for a number of reasons unique to that time. However, the essential formula for epidemics still exists. Viruses sometimes jump species, for instance from pigs to human. This could happen at any time, anywhere in the world. And of course, flu viruses are constantly mutating. Usually mutations are minor, but occasionally a big mutation can happen. This has happened a few times in recent history. For instance, the Russian flu of 1889 killed about 1 million people. The Asian flu of 1957 killed about 2 million. And the Hong Kong flu of 1968 also killed about 2 million. Then in 2018, exactly 100 years after the outbreak of Spanish flu, a mutation brought a particularly deadly flu to the US and Australia. As of 2018, there is one strain of avian flu, an H5 type, that has managed to infect humans, but so far cannot jump between people. However, that particular strain of flu is frightening in its potential, according to Donald Burke, MD, former director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Immunization Research. Of the people who have been affected, it has been deadly in over 75% of cases. If that type of flu adapted to human infection, it could be catastrophic. So could it happen again? Yes, it could. As Burke said, when it comes to the probability of a pandemic flu, I think everyone would say it's not if, it's when. However, there is reason to be hopeful. When a new kind of flu emerged in 2009, a swine flu, just like the Spanish flu, officials did not waste any time acting. Public health officials acted swiftly, putting emergency epidemic plans into operation. We were lucky that the 2009 swine flu, though very contagious, was not a deadly strain, and it showed us that response matters a great deal. In fact, the way we respond to the next big epidemic could mean the difference between life or death. If you enjoyed this video, please click like and subscribe to Education World for more videos.